BioShock Infinite deeply upsets me. Like a mental tapeworm, it has wriggled its way into my brainstem and made me a confused mess. I keep thinking about this thing. It's taking up too much of my brain attic that usually keeps things like the license plate number of the black van that keeps showing up around my neighborhood. You can't get me, stupid! So why does this game have such a hold on me? I think it's because it wants to be about so much, but it's only ever about one thing. I think it does really well, but there's so much annoying other stuff going on that it's like walking into your cozy bedroom and some jerk made the wallpaper one giant optical illusion. It gives me a headache the more I look. This is what MK Ultra was like. I need to exercise some demons to get my life back in order, so I went down a list and nope, won't, can't, we'll start with this one. But this requires deep analysis. We need to go through this game with a fine-tooth comb to pull all the thematic ticks from its mangy fur. Some are more swollen than others. The story of BioShock Infinite's development seems to be a kind of legendary nightmare. Now, normally I'm against placing all the weight of a project on any one individual, given how collaborative game making has to be by nature. But it seems to me that much of Infinite's development was made horrific because of the game's director, one Ken Levine. Levine has a storied history in game development, being the lead writer behind System Shock 2 as well as the director of the original BioShock. So you might as well consider him the anti-hero of Infinite's lengthy development. Much of the work on the game became hellish because Levine would scrap months of artistry to fit an ever-changing vision, like he was laying the tracks as he went and costing an insane amount of time. To the point where other producers were brought in to finalize the product and were shocked to find that there was no build of the game available, just disjointed parts. Some of this can be attributed to publisher demands, such as 2K scrapping the planned multiplayer modes to focus on the main story, and the outsourcing to other development teams with no clear communication down a production pipeline, leading to a ton of wasted effort and money. But apparently Levine's style of directing led to much of the conflict, as he would often get into screaming matches with employees over a vision that must have existed only nebulously in his head. It can be considered a minor miracle that BioShock Infinite exists at all, thanks to the efforts of closers like Rod Ferguson brought onto the producer role to wrangle Levine. This necessitated crunch in order to coalesce this stream of ideas and half-baked builds into a final, playable product. Now, I don't want to paint too negative a picture of Mr. Levine here. It seems to me he more or less had the rug pulled out from under him, with corporate moving a lot of the creative partners in charge of the nuts and bolts of the production process over to the BioShock 2 team, leaving the guy to run this ship all on his lonesome for the first time. It certainly didn't help that the development team of Infinite had ballooned to a massive size, and would only grow larger and larger to accommodate the lengthy turnaround time. Basically, nobody seemed to be having a good time making this thing. Frankly, I'm surprised more people in the gaming industry don't keep a loaded gun in their desk, given how frightful the labor conditions over there seem to be. Which is especially ironic given some of the subject matter Infinite ended up covering, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We have a good few ticks to inspect before we get there. So while the original BioShock was a very intentionally constructed experience, Infinite is more or less a stitched-together series of concepts they had lying around when the bosses sent in the cleanup crew to tell Ken Levine to chill the fuck out. Does that make every shortcoming Infinite has the fault of Mr. Levine exclusively? Of course not, but the fact of the matter is there's a lot of baffling creative decisions on display here that are just downright flawed in their very inception. Behind the scenes troubles or not, a bunch of these ideas would have still face-planted pretty hard. Plus, the guy has a liberal arts degree. He's used to being bullied. I think that sets the stage fairly nicely. We won't be covering either the original BioShock or Burial at Sea, only because with the former I really don't think I have anything to say that hasn't already been said by people with the pain threshold of actually reading Atlas Shrugged. I'm throwing out Burial at Sea because I think it only serves to complicate the narrative of BioShock Infinite, and boy howdy does this game not need any extra help complicating its own narrative. I want to take a bite out of this piece as it was originally intended, and just throw out all the needless connections that were made after the fact. With all that said, let's ascend to the heavenly city of Columbia and take a look at this hideous miracle. Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to hear that anyway. We open in 1912 off the coast of Maine. We play as Booker DeWitt, a bruiser with a violent past hired to rescue a girl and bring her back to New York. We're joined by two quirky assholes who were so busy debating each other's syntax that they didn't think to bring a third raincoat. Then they leave us to die. Who were those guys? Fuck if I know. This is a fun opening. It's riffing on the intro to the original, only instead of descending past Randian iconography, we climb the lighthouse with a traditional hymn playing in the background. It's neat, and it's dramatic enough to build the tension while we make our way up to God knows what. Look, we even have a face this time. There won't be no silent protagonist this go around. This fella's got a personality, and with that, a conception of the hell he thinks he's going to. It's one of the benefits of being alive. We've got to ascend to the tippy top of this here lighthouse and... shit. I know I shouldn't have dropped that accounting school. Eventually, I get this puzzle figured out, and now we're free to sit in this dentist chair. Unfortunately, that dentist chair is a deceitful bitch and shackles us down against our will like it's my ex-wife or something, and we're rocketed off to the skies, the music rising and the pressure building until... Hallelujah. Welcome to Columbia. Even before we get to the city proper, the Welcome Center is still gorgeous. I'm a sucker for stained glass. We wade our way through baptismal waters until we find a mini congregation blocking our only exit. It looks like the only way out is to accept this preacher's baptism, for forgiveness is the only path into the city. He waterboards us.
I don't know, brothers and sisters, but this one doesn't look clean to me.
Now listen, I'm no expert, but what makes you think God forgives me more the second time you dunk me? That priest really puts his back into it too, because we're about drowned and are treated to a vision of our own sins. We're in our private investigations office, and here we get to see why Booker took this job in the first place. The man was being swallowed by drink and debt. There's someone knocking at the door, demanding we honor some deal a delirious Booker refuses. Upon opening the door, though, we're treated to a brief vision of apocalypse as Zeppelins rain hellfire on New York City. One sets us ablaze and sends us back to the land of the living. Thank God, it was just a dream. I don't actually live in New York. Now we're able to make it into the city proper. This isn't a dilapidated corpse of a dystopia like Rapture was. No, this is a bustling and functioning utopia that we get to walk around in and get a sense of the culture. And what a culture it is. Columbia is a fascinating setting to me. Up there in terms of my favorite settings in video games. Though, to preface all this for how much my opinion is worth, another contender for that list is Pong. Based on every video game legend I could find, both BioShock games were based on whatever books the team were passing around at the time. In the case of BioShock Original, Levine drew inspiration from the writings of utopian thinkers before zeroing in on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, a book that I would use to give myself paper cuts on the webbings of my fingers before I would ever use it as reading material. In Infinite's case, amongst a lot of ideas spun out from the motivations of the art style, Levine drew heavily from Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City, a book centered around the construction of the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Also a serial killer. That World's Fair is also known as the World's Columbian Exposition, by the way. It was to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus farting and shitting and pissing himself to the New World, and to celebrate how far America had come in terms of societal progress. It also had an immense influence on art and literature at the time, so it seems like that was the batter Levine poured into the mold of what had already been made. Also, when I say societal progress, you gotta understand the perspective we're talking about here. Now, I'm no student of history, but I'm gonna do my best to condense this story as quick as I can. It has a purpose, I swear to God. For some people, things were getting a little cramped, but over to the west, there was plenty of land for us to use. But there were people who lived there. But we wanted the land. So much so that we eventually just went in and murdered all of them. And one of the ways they could justify this to themselves was through the idea of American exceptionalism, this religious belief in American democracy and our freedom to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that story rang true for a lot of people, but for it to continue to ring true, we need that land. So we turned it into a holy quest to spread our incredible republic. I mean, take a look at this painting. The angel Columbia is guiding us westward, lighting the dark with her American pioneers and the coming of civilization. Those indigenous folks sure are scared, and I would be too if I saw a lady that huge. And I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but we really obliterated the people that lived there. And then we sent them away, and when we couldn't see them, we didn't have to feel bad at all. I only bring this up to illustrate the portrait of the America that paved the way to the 1892 World's Fair. The first World's Fair to use electricity, the World's Fair that sent ripples into the minds of people who paint pictures and write books. I think that, if we're going to honestly interrogate America as a culture, the reality of westward expansion should be an element of that. It's a challenging thing to confront, I admit, but one of the benefits of pulling from a work of past art is that we're not bound by the same conceptions of reality as the people who made it. You guys want to really portray a setting that holds a mirror to 1912 America? Let's go all in. I'm genuinely very excited. Just kind of keep this tucked away in your brain folds to see how we tackle it later. For now, let's just soak in the art direction. I adore walking around Columbia every time I replay Infinite. All the watercolor townhouses and floating statues. We'll see how the city has a theme park-like design as we explore to find a landmark and get our bearings. But I'm glad, however it ended up this way, that this was the direction they chose. I feel like I'm getting a living piece of a utopia, soaking up all the reasons why someone would think this is a paradise through Booker's eyes. The first thing I noticed were the weird statues dedicated to fathers Wash, Jeffy, and Frank, and I hear people praying in wonder at their great deeds for American independence. Another thing I love about Columbia is how it parodies American culture by literally deifying some of the founding fathers. I'm sure they had plenty of art to pull from for inspiration on that one. It's the perfect way to satirize this country's religious fetishization of ideas like democracy, and the people who wrote the laws that led to a prosperous republic if you happen to be born on the right side of it. This is a home run. Whoever's ideas somehow melted together to form this gooey mass that you hit with the idea bat. My point is, American culture being satirized like this feels uniquely gratifying to me. As we make our way through Columbia, we'll be catching snippets of conversation that help to flesh out the society we're about to be engulfed by. These people worship Columbia's leader, one Father Comstock, who claims to be a prophet blessed with divine knowledge of future events. We happened to arrive on the day of the Columbia Raffle and Fair, a direct riff on the 1893 World's Fair that takes the theme park aesthetic that carried the art direction and literalizes it into the game world. Like, we learned that the fair is meant to celebrate the anniversary of Columbia's independence from American soil through these parade floats, aestheticizing whatever the real history is. We also meet the 4 gayest men in Columbia. What a progressive state this is. I'm glad these guys can be so open up here. Personally, I think the fair is a fun way to tutorialize things while also doing a hefty bit of world building. We see this Jeremiah Fink fellow showing off the vigors you'll get to be using later. Here you can get a chance to sample them while soaking in the fantastic art direction. I feel like all involved have applied the artistic standards of what they were being inspired by to represent a world that is uniquely theirs and serves the story being told. I mean, this is basically Call of Duty for kids in 1912 Columbia. Super America painted with the brushes of history and the ideas that fueled the engines of progress that made that history. You see why this setting is absolutely fascinating to me? And look, we're about to get in some uncomfortable territory here, and thank God the team didn't shy away from showing it. To accurately satirize American values, you have to show the reality of what those values look like in practice. If that does make you uncomfortable, a benefit of art is that you're now given the opportunity to interrogate why. And there's no right or wrong answer, it's just going to be what feels true to you based on your experience. But we can't be mad at the art for posing the question by holding up a funhouse mirror to the reality we're all forced to live through. On our way to the fair, we're given a telegram telling us to keep our presence here on the down low, and whatever we do, we shouldn't pick number 77. You know, this was so unhelpful that it could only have been written by the geniuses who dropped me off. I guess they're the Lutesses. Well, once again, thanks for nothing. Past the games and the overstimulated handyman, we find the way to the raffle and fair is closed to us, until we drink deep from this neat flask to get our first vigor, possession. You know, for a city littered with vending machines, this feels like a very easily accessible exploit. And when you look who's behind the gate, it's the Lutesses, and again, they are of no help. They ask me to flip a coin, I do, it lands on heads. Apparently it does that a lot. That was neat. Y'all going anywhere, or are you just gonna stand there like a couple of assholes? From here we get to explore a little more of Columbia before we come up on the raffle. This is where things get a little weird. Comstock somehow knew we would be coming, because there are posters warning of the false shepherd, and that the vigilant citizens of Columbia will know him by the brand on his hand. The very same brand we wear on our own flesh. I hear this get called out as a stupid moment, like why would Booker not immediately cover it up? And to be honest, I don't really mind that the guy left it exposed, but it is wild to me that no one noticed it yet. Maybe if they had made the marking a little less obvious, like putting it on the underside of Booker's wrist or something. I think the dramatic weight that gets added by coming upon these signs foretelling our arrival justifies their inclusion though. I can remember being so intrigued by Columbia on its face, but this prophecy angle did add enough of a mystery to keep me really chomping at the bit to learn more. Who is this Comstock guy, and how did he know we would one day be coming for the girl in the tower? This raffle seems to be of great cultural importance to the people of Columbia. And hey, it's free to participate. Frankly, I see no reason not to engage in the festivities. What are the chances I even get a winning number? Uh-oh. Well, maybe the prize will be something nice and patriotic, like getting to pet a red, white, and blue poodle. What's the worst thing it could possibly... Yeah, that was the worst thing. By winning the raffle, you get to be the first to throw a baseball at an interracial couple. You're given the choice between hurling it at the couple or the announcer, and I do not know what happens if you choose to throw it at the couple because I'm really worried about going to hell. Not that it matters, because before the ball leaves our hands, the local constabulary finally notices that giant brand on the back of our hand, and now this entire town aims to murder us. Luckily, we're a rough and tumble private eye, and with quick thinking, we procure a skyhook and use it as a makeshift weapon to help in our escape. We've still got to get to Monument Island, but now we've got an entire floating city's worth of American cops trying to mow us down. We shoot our way through the streets of Columbia, get a new vigor, and with the path to the tower closed, we have to cut across the city to find another way to the island. Thank God that in here I got a bunch of new pants for buying the season pass. Kinda takes the sting out of the racism, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. I was trying to be optimistic. Fighting our way across the rooftops will eventually lead us to the lodgings of the Fraternal Order of the Raven. What is that, like a frat house that's really into 19th century poetry? Oh. They were doing phrenology in here too? This really is a frat house. Killing this frat guy from the Ku Klux Klan will net you what is, in my humble opinion, the coolest vigor in the game. The murder of crows. Use it to freak out some cops before riding a sky rail up to the gondola that'll take us to the tower. This is also where Father Comstock makes his debut to the player. He tells his men to stand down, and then taunts us with knowledge of our past sins. He says he can see every one, every depraved action we've ever taken that carved out little pieces of our humanity. Then he yells at us about some girl named Anna, and it gives us a nosebleed. Comstock Zeppelin then tries to vaporize us, but we fight our way through it to get access to the controls before the prophet taunts us one last time. Which I think was a signal for this lady to kill herself for political reasons. This place is fucking wild. Well, we're down a blimp, but we managed to get spit out on the doorstep of Monument Island. Time to see why Father Comstock has his lamb kept under such tight lock and key. The set design here is top notch, as always. He uses such dehumanizing clinical language to describe this girl we're about to see, calling her the specimen and posting big red signs telling people to avoid this dangerous creature. The deeper we go, we see how they've kept tabs on her the girl's entire life, and we're made pretty uncomfortable by the degree of surveillance these people have her under. To somehow make things even weirder, this lady's personal items change form before us in this strange machine, and a voxophone recording tells us that the nerds running this place are scared shitless of the girl locked up in this tower.
What the hell are they doing to her?
The room up ahead gives little in the way of answers, with only more of those pulsating mechanisms that are somehow tied to the lamb upstairs. We take an elevator from this laboratory up to where the quote-unquote specimen is located in her tower. We see what she's been occupying her time with, this room being dedicated to lockpicking and code breaking. A bit more traversal through this gargantuan monument to Comstock's prophecy will finally introduce you to the girl in the tower. She's apparently got Paris on the brain, and she runs off to her dining room, where we get a greater snapshot of her life through all these drawings on the wall, and the painting she's using to open a wound in the fabric of reality. Excuse me? She can do that?
Whatever that was. It's got nothing to do with the job at hand.
Fair enough, Booker. I mean, what the fuck was he supposed to do, go home? Damn, we can even hear her singing as we approach the next creepshow window in her library here at the top of her tower. This is followed by a sphincter tightening section where we have nowhere left to go but up. Although it seems this chandelier was not built to hold Booker's weight, which is very cheeky from something that was oh so climbable. But with this fall, we finally come face to face with Elizabeth, and she tosses books at us.
Are you real?
I'm real enough.
Why would you say it like that, dude? Suddenly, a statue begins to whistle a tune and something big starts making noise outside, something Elizabeth knows and is scared of. Luckily for us, one of the gifts given to us by the Lutesses happened to be a key to our release, and we follow Elizabeth as this strange beast makes terrible calls as it begins to tear apart the tower to stop us from leaving. The tower shakes and crumbles beneath us as the thing slashes its way through the metal that once made this place Elizabeth called home. Unfortunately, while we wait for the elevator, she's made to realize that these people have been studying her every move, though there's little time to process this because we're introduced to Songbird as he smashes away at that elevator shaft, but then has difficulty taking the elevator. I suppose we'll go for the stairs. Once again, we make it outside and tell Elizabeth to get up higher, till Songbird has finally torn away at the top of the tower and the two of us go into freefall. The skyhook saves us once again in a sequence that really doesn't require much from me, but is still a fun set piece as we escape on nearby sky rails to try and shake this winged monstrosity. The shattered pieces of the Landsformer cage batter away at our hope of escape, and the waters of Columbia swallow up Booker and Elizabeth. This may be the very thing that saves us though, as Songbird almost nabs us if not for him not working well under pressure, and he breaks his contact. Here's hoping Booker doesn't mind getting his lungs a little wet, and by that I mean full of salt water. Well, we're not showing great signs of a trauma-free experience here because Booker fades into another vision of his office, though now with Elizabeth there, chanting and humming while this strange man in New York demands her to wipe away his debt. We open the door and begin calling out for some woman named Anna, and we fade back into conscious living with her name on our tongue. We refuse further help from Elizabeth, and she happens to hear music in the distance. This is her first taste of true freedom, and she can't wait to experience the pleasures of human togetherness. We just need a quick nap. Power nap complete, sleepyhead Booker DeWitt awakes and has no fucking clue where that lady went. So we've ended up in Battleship Bay, and we can ask around to see if anyone...
Look at this one. Why don't you just sleep it off, chum?
Shut up, racist. You hear quite a bit of racism on the way to Elizabeth, actually. I'm just gonna go let Booker deal with that while I make a note about this game's change in structure over its predecessors. One of the big draws of the original BioShock for many people were open-ended levels that let you soak in the culture of Rapture at your own pace, hearing characters exposit to you the story of that underwater casket in arcs exclusive to scattered audio logs. Columbia still has that, but to a lesser degree because of the more linear structure that was probably a compromise made to get a finished build of the game. But I think it serves the core aesthetic of Infinite, as my new dad, Ken Levine, takes my hand and guides me through set piece after set piece, ride after ride. Plus, I happen to think what is on display is so interesting and laid out to you in such a digestible way that Columbia has a greater impact on me when it comes to being a successful ideological parody. Oh, look at her dance, enjoying the outside air for the first time. She's so happy, and even invites us to join the circle of skips and hops. We refuse because Booker has an ego problem. We then feed her the story that the First Lady airship will be their vehicle to Paris. With that, we set off together, and Elizabeth becomes our new companion. It's so endearing watching her interact with the environment. And it's so cool that the theme park design happened to have a lot of overlap with the Disney aesthetic. And we get this character taking design cues from classic princesses to create someone who will eventually grow to be a kind of princess in a strictly BioShock sense. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Imagine being a Disney princess in a cartoon made in 1912 America. I shudder to think. Anyway, past a horrible salesman, we run into the Lutesses again, who ask us to choose between two brooches. I opt for the cage, because despite all my rage, I am still just a gay man with AIDS. A crowd gathers to watch Monument Island collapse to the Sodom below. I may have had nothing to do with this, but we should leave anyway. Even this early in the game, I'm loving the interactions between Booker and Elizabeth. If there's one thing I get really pretentious about, it's dialogue. I swear to God, I'll turn something off if it's clear to me the written words are there just for the sake of filling airtime, and do nothing to express to me anything about the characters or the story. I'm happy to report that that isn't the case here, and something I think Levine has a real talent for is writing dialogue. Elizabeth speaks in bookish language, reflecting her sheltered and isolated upbringing with only a library for company. She's well read, naive but witty. Booker, on the other hand, stays away from any $5 words and focuses on streetwise slang and quick-to-the-point delivery. But he clearly isn't a dumb brute. We've seen him act fast on his feet and come up with a story to get Elizabeth on the move, a lie he delivers in a way that Elizabeth is able to trust and believe him. And of course, the vocal performances are carrying quite a bit of that emotional weight. I'm waiting to highlight these, but early on, Courtney Draper has such a brightness to her delivery, such an earnest, childlike enjoyment for the mundanities of Colombian living that you can't help but be enamored with her from the start. One can also get enamored with her lockpicking skills, if eventually you see a neat hat tantalizing you behind a locked door. For now though, Elizabeth opens the way past a police barricade through this employees-only passageway, and we get our first sense of life for those on the other end of the American dream, and the way these people are made to act around those they've been told are their betters. We even see the couple from the lottery, who thank us by offering one such neat hat. We make our way to the ticket counter, ready to arrive at the First Lady's airship. This guy seems to be in the middle of a phone call though. I don't want to interrupt. It is a very suspicious sounding phone call, I'll admit, but I refuse to be a prejudiced individual. There's enough of that going around. Let's just tell him we're in a... Oh, this is the last time I'm ever nice to a customer service representative. So we get ambushed at the counter. Elizabeth is horrified by our casual murders, and she's able to slip past the shutter to escape from us. We have to stay behind and deal with these cops, which is thankfully made easier with the procurement of my oh-so-precious shotgun. You gotta be cool with tossing one of your weapons to keep it, though. Yeah, Infinite ditches the weapon wheel in favor of a Halo-esque 2-gun limit, and you have to scrounge around the battlefield for others if yours runs out of ammo. This is on top of a Halo-esque shield you get from the Lutesses. I'm not against any of this on principle, so let's just see if they learn the right lessons from that big green Bible verse. Catch up with Elizabeth to initiate a little heart-to-heart. She calls us a monster for the killing we've been doing, but we remind her that these people went to great expense to keep her locked away, and that the violence will only stop once Elizabeth is far, far away from Columbia. She accepts this, and bandages our wound. Wow, what a nuanced understanding of a context in which violence was unavoidable. I sure hope the game doesn't shit the bed when it comes to this theming later. Something about fishing for birds seems more inhumane than actual fishing. I'm picturing them having to smash the pigeon's head against that railing to stop the thing from flapping around all freaked out. Anyway, this is Soldier's Field. Adding to the theme park design is this open area where we get a chance to breathe and chat with Elizabeth. Her AI is programmed to react to various set dressings, and from what I understand was a pain in the ass to implement. I'm glad they stuck the landing on this, because hearing and seeing Elizabeth interact with the world does wonders to make her feel like an actual character, instead of some ball and chain we've got to lug around in between all the shooting.
What?
I was just imagining you on the carousel.
I love her. Also, that song shouldn't exist yet. I'm starting to think something fishy might be going on here. Yes, as an American myself, everything so far has been in order, but this makes me question things. The gondola to the airship is down, because in the fashion of true modernity, you can have access to wonders that push the boundaries of mankind's capability as a species. It's just that none of it will fucking work. This thing is powered by Shock Jockey, a vigor you can only get at this Hall of Heroes. This elevator shorts out on the way down to the hall though, so we get a fun scene between Booker and Elizabeth as he fixes the short while she freaks out over a bee. Then, to get rid of it, she opens another wound to reality, or tear as she calls it. Elizabeth explains that she's been able to open these windows to other worlds ever since she was a child, though this one also has a songbird, so we hastily close it. Well, the crazy bus has officially left the station. Elizabeth's ability to open tears between dimensions is something that becomes a greater focus later on, but even from here I can see the looming brain hemorrhage I'll get from trying to explain that part. But the crazy bus still has quite a few stops before we make it there. Incidentally, the crazy bus is what I call it when me and my buddies all climb inside Ken Levine's ass and make him run in circles while he tells us about books he read in college. Approaching the Hall of Heroes, we find it's been vandalized pretty thoroughly after some off-screen shootout. The man behind all this is one Cornelius Slate, a man Booker has a history with from their time together in the U.S. Cavalry. Slate reveals to us that he and his boys are battling Comstock over the man's revisions of history. Booker notes that the Prophet never led the battalion DeWitt himself served under, and Slate emphasizes the man never served at all, despite what the displays commemorating his military victories will tell you. For this, Slate chose to go to war with Comstock, and it's a war we're now caught in the middle of. And to crank up the heat even further, Slate sicks his men on us, promising them the opportunity of a warrior's death at the hands of a true soldier. I want to call special attention to the Hall of Heroes because I think it's an expertly crafted set piece that carries a lot of thematic weight behind it. There are two main attractions that are dedicated to Colombian history that we have to fight through to get to our shock jockey. One dedicated to the Boxer Rebellion and one to the Battle of Wounded Knee. The Boxer Rebellion was a ripple effect of imperialism, an anti-colonial movement in China that manifested in the killing of Christian missionaries and, in this version of history, a military retaliation by Colombia. The U.S. government condemned this attack, and as a result, Colombia seceded from the Union, creating the environment for this skyfaring city and its horrific statecraft. But the attraction I really want to highlight is the battle, or massacre, depending on who you ask, of Wounded Knee. Our Booker is revealed to have taken part in this massacre, which, historically speaking, represented a final violent confrontation that came as a result of the Native American genocide carried out during westward expansion. It was a stroke of creative genius to involve Booker in this historical event, and I don't use that word lightly, on account of the only genius I know is the homeless guy who lives on my block and tells me all the ways the government uses to put chemicals in my food to turn me gay. The reason it was so smart to involve our lead character in this massacre is twofold. Firstly, it sets up Booker's desire for redemption. We hear tale of the violent actions DeWitt carried out on behalf of the United States, and are made to sympathize with this man horrified by the senseless murders he partook in. But beyond that, Comstock and Booker's participation in Wounded Knee serves a deeper thematic purpose. The only reason the United States was able to come forth as the keeper of the world's financial torch was because of how it exploited the other, namely the slave blacks and the Native Americans. Even after emancipation, expansion was only possible by the genocide of American Indians, a phrasing I only use to further emphasize the folly of Columbus and those who worship him. The point is this: one of the pillars of the American dream is that anyone can make a go of it anywhere in this country, and one of the necessary pillars to support this fiction at a certain point in time involved the expulsion of Native Americans from the land they called home. If you're going to parody America, it must be stated. Slave labor and genocide built the wealth of this country, and I'm excited to say BioShock Infinite doesn't shy away from emphasizing those facts. Nor does it shy away from emphasizing the way that domination was represented in the culture to justify great systems of extraction. And, on a character level, if you know the twist, think about what it means for Comstock specifically to turn Wounded Knee into a glorified attraction, given how much we know it haunts Booker. The character stuff through this entire section is really engaging as a whole, as information about the player avatar's history is dramatically trickled out to us in such a way that we learn so much about these two people.
What did Slate mean? What did you try to erase?
Now that you're out of yours, you might realize cages have their advantages.
A choice is better than none, Mr. DeWitt. No matter what the outcome.
Yeah. What if you woke up one day and realized you didn't like what you chose?
We get another reveal after these displays as we get to walk through an attraction dedicated to, of all people, Elizabeth, and it's made clear to us that she is Comstock's daughter, made to grow up in her tower so she might one day fulfill her destiny as the Prophet's heir. According to these less than accurate depictions of Colombian history, Lady Comstock was murdered by Daisy Fitzroy, leader of the resistance group the Vox Populi, a group that still acts as a fly in the soup of blissful ignorance. So up ahead is an arena where we'll have our final confrontation with Slade, but unfortunately Booker is too overweight to make it through these bars. Thankfully, we're introduced to a new gameplay mechanic, where Elizabeth will open a tear and bring in something useful to us. This lady has already been scrounging around the battlefield for supplies she'll toss our way, and this extra level of interaction between the two of us is just another reason to love Elizabeth. The team has crafted a very endearing character here, and much of the tools they use stem from the medium itself. I've praised the writing already, but the use of gameplay mechanics and technical wizardry to create such a reactive AI are ways to connect us to the story that you aren't going to get outside of video games. It's a shame that these arenas aren't more thoughtfully constructed, though. More often than not, you're just thrown into an open area and made to shoot at people that will either rush at you or hang back and spit bullets at you occasionally. Now, I don't play a lot of first-person shooters, so I don't consider myself an expert on the genre or anything. Frankly, if you consider me an expert on anything, I think you should reevaluate your standards. But in my experience, the best arena shooters use very finely tuned level design and very but readable enemies to create situations where you think on your feet to best utilize the terrain and your weaponry to engage with the challenge on offer. These guys just kind of run at you. or almost come to a complete stop to lob some shots your way. Even on hard, the only real difference I noticed was bullets doing more damage, nothing that fundamentally elevated the challenge. At least I can have some fun switching up my vigor and shooting play. That makes me feel cool. Fighting our way through a final gauntlet of Slate's forces will send us back to the Fitzroy display, where the man lies holding the shock jockey we came for. Booker reaches for it, but Slate still breathes and demands we put a stop to this. You're given another button press choice here, and I usually opt to kill the guy. It just seems like what Booker would do here. I can see him thinking the kindest thing he could do for this man would be to provide the death he desires above all else.
Slate himself was almost a really interesting foil to Booker, but as it stands, the character himself leaves a lot to be desired. This is a man who hated no particular enemy, according to the game. The man just found his soul drawn to the bloodshed of war, to the thunderous death found on the battlefield. That gives us some interesting groundwork to build from, having both Slate and Booker find they have an inclination to violence. The drama comes from how they differ in dealing with this realization. Booker is broken by it, tormented by a life he just can't seem to crawl his way out of. Slate has come to accept his lot and glorify warfare above all else, which is why he finds Comstock's stolen valor so egregious. But to me, this doesn't go far enough. There are much deeper levels we could go towards making Slate less of a screaming lunatic and more of a tragic figure that creates much greater commentary on the American values we're investigating here. Consider that Slate decides to raise the Hall of Heroes because he's against the attractions on principle, regardless of the changes to the history. Slate can still be at peace with his violent nature, but he doesn't have to love what he's capable of to make him an interesting parallel. The guy in my head is a weary soldier who's accepted that he's a killer, and has made it his life's vocation. He's resigned to the horrors of warfare, at a point in his life where things like manifest destiny are just noise to him, needless rationalizations that chitter in the background of a war but play no part in Slate's life spent behind a gun. However, this Slate has a humanity in him that recognizes his life's work for what it is: senseless killing. He's a butcher, a murderer, and he knows it. But he also knows that he has only been able to find true peace under the hail of gunfire. He can't help but do what he does. That is the tragedy. This would also tie into the themes of determinism we'll be getting to much later, and that would just make for a fuller thematic picture. From there, this Slate would be offended at how America specifically warps history to fit a political narrative. All these racist caricatures are pulled from artwork drawn up in the US, and that's no accident. Slate's indignation would highlight a particular symptom of American culture, our aestheticization and commodification of violence. In Super America here, the culture and the national identity have been folded into one, which is why we're getting Disney-rise through war crimes. Imagine if Slate were appalled not because of regret, but because at this point in his life the man recognizes there was no heroism to be found out in Wounded Knee or northern China. It was just killing. And killing should not be reduced to theme park attractions and Funko Pops. And to really cement his tragic connection to Booker, maybe destroying the Hall of Heroes is, to Slate, his only chance at redemption. Those battles he fought in were just means to draw blood from the soil, but maybe if he can tear down Comstock's monuments to those massacres and provide a soldier's death to all the men he knows he's leading to a suicide mission, then maybe, just maybe, if he can get this one thing right, he can find absolution. Or the closest thing to it he'll be able to get. This will be the first time he's killing not on the behalf of a nation or at the whims of rulers. He's doing this because he believes it to be the right thing to do. This would parallel Booker's arc as it progresses, and would make Slate a much more powerful character. Or I think so, at least. As it stands, the level itself provides some very interesting commentary, but I'm left wanting when it comes to the writing behind Slate as a guy. Well, we got the shock jockey. Time to return to Soldier's Field to power up that gondola. On the elevator ride there, we ask Elizabeth about those tears she creates. She tells us that she always thought of them as doors to other worlds, and that in her youth it wasn't a matter of finding these tears. Instead, she could create them and go wherever she wanted.
But I always wanted to come back.
To what?
I don't know. My family?
Booker inquires further, asking how all of this is even possible. Elizabeth tells him she spent a mountain of time reading books on physics and the sciences, hoping to discover the answer.
Yeah? And what did that teach you?
That there's a world of difference between what we see and what is.
Well, the crazy bus is just trucking along now, isn't it? We call the gondola that has taken its sweet-ass time, and we're ambushed by Comstock, to whom Elizabeth firmly declares that she's leaving Columbia. The Prophet responds by sending us his forces. The skyline fights would actually be pretty engaging if the AI didn't ultimately get lost on them, and so by the end of the battle you're always waiting for one or two stragglers to find their way around on these things. I mean, yeah, other than that, it's still pretty mediocre. It's more of an in-theory kind of fun. Also, I've decided how I feel about the 2-gun limit. I think it blows. Again though, I'm not against it on principle, it's just that as it stands, this decision doesn't mesh well with others in the world. Like, we can still buy ammo at vending machines and pay to upgrade certain weapons. However, the upgrades are not reflected visually, unlike BioShock 1, and so as penance I demand Ken Levine's scalp. The limitation could have worked though, if the story they're trying to tell stars a scrappy scoundrel for whom shooting a gun is their stock and trade. Maybe with a more fine-tuned ammo system, I really would be having to swap on the fly and experiment with all the tools in the toolkit. And on top of that, it would make those moments when Elizabeth tosses us ammo for one of the weapons so much more impactful if there's a chance we'll have to drop a favorite for something with a fuller clip. And then just keep the upgrade system. I think it could still work if the decision comes between upgrading an easily available bullet dispensary or decking out one of the rarer, more explosive tools. Definitely don't let me buy ammo anymore. Keeping one foot in the design of the original BioShock and another in the potato salad of design cues from Halo ultimately neuters the experience either kind of play would have had they fully committed to one system. If you remove vending machines as a whole, I feel like you lose nothing. Between scrounging around arenas and Elizabeth's impressive nose for morphine, I've never felt it necessary to use one of these things for something other than ammunition. Sidebar, the respawn system sucks too. Elizabeth will pull you to safety and give you a steroid injection while the enemies you left behind do the same thing. To this I say, I enjoy feeling like I've conquered an arena by getting better at understanding the level design and enemy behavior, not the feeling of chipping away at a wall with the back of my hand. Anyway, our ride comes along and we make it up to the First Lady airship. At long last, we put in the coordinates to New York. Although it turns out Elizabeth is a nerd because she actually knows what those numbers mean and realizes we're not going to Paris. We explain to her that there's a man in New York who's promised to pay off Booker's more hazardous debts in exchange for her. Elizabeth begins to weep, and in our attempt to comfort her, she thwacks us on the head with a wrench, which sends us spiraling into unconsciousness. The downed Mr. DeWitt flutters in and out of consciousness, and he catches glimpses of our ship being boarded and Elizabeth slipping away, leaving us to be made prisoner of the Vox Populi. We awake, the wind battering our face as we're dangled out of this moving airship. We're over the Finkton docks, and you find out in one of the earliest Vox recordings from one Jeremiah Fink that the guys you hear singing are criminals brought up from a prison in Georgia. So we're being held by the ankles above a forced labor system. Awesome. We're brought back in to face Daisy Fitzroy, supposed killer of Lady Comstock and leader of the Vox Populi Popular Resistance Group. We tell her that we've commandeered this airship and have desperate need of it, but Daisy could certainly use it too. She then starts to go into a speech about how Comstock is the god of the white and the wealthy. But in the Vox, there is the spirit of the righteous common folk glowing bright behind their crusade. It's not a sales pitch we're interested in, we really just want to hear the terms and conditions. Daisy tells us to get her firearms promised to her by a gunsmith in Finkton. If we get her those, then she'll relinquish the airship to us. We're then tossed onto the Finkton docks and left to figure shit out on our own. Can I just say, they butchered this character. Call that foreshadowing. All we get of Daisy Fitzroy right now is that she's not afraid to cut a dirty deal for a cause she seems to be in the business of giving rehearsed speeches over. Whatever that tells you. It's just a snippet of a character right now, but I've got plenty to say about Daisy Fitzroy later. For now, we rummage around Finkton docks, catching workers building the commodities we've seen being enjoyed by the wealthy, pasty white Colombians. They all wipe or hammer in perfect rehearsed unison, and we hear why that might be as we catch the propaganda that blares from Fink to his workers, encouraging them to be thoughtless workhorses that need not consider the nature of their situation, only learn to be happy in having their time controlled by Jeremiah Fink. Fink also has the police on his side to ensure compliance, which to me is a distinctly American-smelling detail to include, given the history we're pulling from. Past the back door is Elizabeth getting thrown off a ship she was hoping to stow away upon. She runs from us and we give chase, wading through tears until Elizabeth opens one that leads her right into the hands of the Colombian authorities. Tackle a pretty decent arena to find her conjuring up a skyline and the chase resumes, until we finally get introduced to a handyman who starts tossing us above untold heights we're now sliding into. Thanks to Elizabeth, another tear saves us from becoming a crater in rural Pennsylvania, and we tell her of a deal we've made to get our airship back. With no other means of leaving the floating city, Elizabeth agrees to partner up with us. So we head towards Finkton and get to hear more loudspeaker messages by Jeremiah, laughing off things like 8-hour workdays and workers' compensation as anarchist ideas that Fink will never let come between his laborers and the livelihood they deserve. Jeremiah Fink is a wild caricature, but in Super America, you go big or go home. And how many times have we heard upper-class owners of capital argue against things like a livable minimum wage because they want to ensure the job market stays open and competitive for the benefit of all potential employees?
Hey, I'm just coming in here with an edit real quick, just in case you're curious on where I stand on this. Warren Buffett is a demonic entity, allegedly. So, there you go.
Fink here is going to become a very interesting screen presence based on how he chooses to literalize the plight of American laborers in the early 20th century. For example, we approach the elevator to Finkton but find it guarded off because the literal job market has closed for today, leaving these destitute people to return to their meager livings. Luckily for us, we're not afraid to lockpick and murder our way to the employees-only lift. An eagle-eyed Elizabeth spots Slate's locker on our way down, and she investigates it to find Lady Comstock's diary. She turns to an entry where it's revealed the prophet told her that his child was the result of divine creation, a lie Lady Comstock decidedly does not believe, and it seems like she was the one who locked Elizabeth in her tower because of this. Damn, that sucks. Elizabeth just wants to leave, and I really want to punch an elevator button, so it seems our goals still align. But the elevator suddenly pauses its descent, and we get a phone call while we're stuck in here. We're transferred over to Mr. Fink himself, who tells us that he's in love with us, basically. Speaking purely in terms of business, of course. Apparently we're his top candidate for a job posting we never applied for, but this guy refuses to elaborate. He tells us his assistant will be waiting to help us with anything we need. The rest of the trip down, we get to see how people are made to live and work in Finkton, with their time constantly dictated to them by Fink's vigilant authority. Work and living exist in mechanical harmony. This is what the guy demands, as we hear him justifying his further exploitation of these people over the loudspeaker. At the bottom, I get a cool new gun, and we meet this gay guy who helps out Fink. What was his name again?
Now, my associate, Mr. Flambeau, will help you with anything you need.
Jesus Christ. We're let loose in Finkton, where the first thing we see is a group of workers bidding on jobs by the time it takes them to complete them, which is another piece of design that satirizes the way the people who own these factories in the real 1912 are interested in you selling your time to them to pay for goods sold at the company store. It was a very uneven relationship between labor and capital at this time, to put it lightly. Inside the gunsmith's shop, we find the place has been ransacked and Chin Lin, the owner, has been taken. We catch his wife weeping before a statue of the Buddha, and eventually she manages to tell us where her husband is being taken, where all the people who disappear go. The Good Time Club. Outside the shop, we're ambushed by another handyman, only this one we have to shoot down in combat. He was guarding where the police have set up a makeshift prison, and killing him will give us access to the club. Although the opposite of a party is going on in here, because Fink reveals he's hosting a job interview to replace this guy he nailed to a wall. Maybe if he stopped doing that, this interview would be unnecessary. Fink then explains to us that he sees growing labor unrest on the horizon, and he could really use an old knuckle-dustin' Pinkerton like Booker DeWitt to quell those potentially violent voices. To get to Chin Lin, we have to finish our interview by going one-on-one against the other applicants. Fink announcing them and their backstories is pretty fun. At the point in history they're trying to represent, it's an interesting choice to depict the guy in Fink's position as a snake oil salesman, conning these people out of their time and money because he was the man who owned the machinery. These fights are less interesting, but my murder of crows has been upgraded to make crowed-up corpses turn into traps in a never-ending series of terrifying dominoes for this computer code. They just can't help but walk into them. Defeating the other applicants will have Fink offer us the job, which we decline. He then tells us he knows all about our little arrangement with Fitzroy, and promises us that he'll get exactly what he wants. Approaching the employees-only section reveals another voxophone, and this is one Fink has left for his brother, Albert, where he confesses he thought his sibling was losing it, having heard those musical tears across Columbia. But now that Jeremiah witnesses how much money can be made off using what one finds in the tears, he gets perky at the idea of advancing his business interests as well. This explains how Fink was able to, along with the support of Comstock, come to own a monopoly over the manufacturing business. The man is clearly very slimy. He leaves a snail trail. But this revealed that the bulk of Fink's wealth was on the back of plagiarism and the result of a man literally being at the right places at the right times. Well, that's a pretty funny way to poke fun at industrial owners of capital under those American systems. Again, a historical plight blown up to a macro view and a sharply delivered piece of satire that offers a perspective on certain ideologies. Like the principles that led to people like Andrew Ryan during the early industrialization of America were founded on the basis of hucksters who happened to be cutthroat enough to make it to the intersection of luck and opportunity, and that they were ripping off the people doing the actual work. Represented here by plagiarism and the labor model of Fink manufacturing itself. I mean, what else would you call taking money from the hands of the people breaking their backs for commodities they can't afford, if not a ripoff? I'm not going to say how one might relate that to the ideologies shaping the world around us today, but you probably don't have to think too hard. Further descent towards the cells will come with a confession from Booker, who tells Elizabeth he used to work for men like Fink as a Pinkerton, beating the flesh of other men who sought to rally together and improve their conditions.
I used to work for folks like Fink.
Really?
I was with the Pinkertons. They'd call us in when the workers got restless.
To do what?
Demonstrate the folly of men striking, throwing down tools.
You hurt people.
I'll tell you this. Sometimes there's precious need for folks like Fitzroy.
Why?
Because of folks like me.
Fink returns over the intercom as we enter Chinlin's cell, promising us that our business with Fitzroy is concluded. We find out after punching the ever-living shit out of a button that he means the gunrunner has been killed, making this one very dead Chinese guy. Not according to the disappearing twins over here, who pop in to use a lot of words to explain physics concepts that still didn't need as many as they chose. Well, kind of. They're poetically implying to Elizabeth that dead is dead from one side of the quantum divide. But from the other side of a tear, one could get a living Chinese guy. All Elizabeth needs to do is open this one-way ticket to another Columbia, and with no other choice, that's what we tell her to do. Ah yes, the crazy bus is making its stops through stupid town, it seems. Now, many people have had various takes on this, and for some, this is where the game officially snapped, and I can see why. Here's my understanding of where the disconnect comes from. Bitchless freaks like me happen to understand from reading comic books is that, once you cross a barrier between realities, unless otherwise stated, all bets are off. Any number of differences could exist between the characters we're about to encounter and the ones that we know. Infinite tries to handwave away any concern by asserting a few times that there's one particular rule these things follow, and I can jive with that, if not for the game then trying to have its cake and eat it too by saying,
Something tells me one dead gunsmith ain't the only thing that's changed.
I'm sorry, for this to work narratively, it probably has to be. To explain why requires a bit of philosophy on my part. You see, most of us consider people, and by extension our characters, to be immutable selves made up of a collection of experiences and choices. By introducing the multiverse, however, one emphasizes that our choices could be otherwise, and therefore the decisions and experiences foundational to a particular character could very well be different. And if that's the case, they might as well be a different person. Infinite will come to emphasize this later, but these are very deep existential ideas that ought to be the focus of a story. And when you're trying to tell a character-driven narrative, you don't do yourself any favors by scrambling the DNA of your actors for the sake of moving the plot forward. Those are just the strings you're pulling on if you want to truly play with the infinite and all its implications. Without setting up strict narrative guardrails, you're inspiring a disconnect from the story, because we understand this group of people could very well be miles different than the people we know. Like maybe in this universe, Daisy Fitzroy is a talking dolphin. Is that possible? I don't know. What's the name of this game again? Here's my solution to this. Don't think about it too hard. Here are the rules we know the story is thrown up already. Firstly, the tears are a form of wish fulfillment. You'll notice I've stopped talking. It's not much, but just go with that, and accept that through Elizabeth's wish fulfillment, we stepped into a world where the deal with Fitzroy was still in place so we could get our airship back, and that the only drastic changes are the ones the story will present to us, for that matter. I don't know, again, think about it too hard and the implications really disconnect you from the narrative, so roll with it. Or don't, and be intentionally pissed off about all the things that don't make sense. But as long as the multiverse remains a fictional concept, why can't we just let go and let Ken Levine show off those cool ideas he got from books he read? Everybody liked it so much the last time he did it. Returning up the stairs, we find this video of Chin-Lin now ends with his dismissal because of the man's friends in high places. And these soldiers get a killer nosebleed from remembering their deaths in the other world. It also appears that the Jeremiah Fink of this universe learned to stop nailing guys, because as we dispose of this police detail, Fink gets angry at the previous head of security's ineffectiveness at keeping us from sneaking into his basement. It appears that guns happen to be right where I left them across the barrier of realities, however. That's nice. Arriving back to Chin-Lin's shop, we find the shrine to the Buddha has been replaced with one to Father Comstock, and the man himself is upstairs having an episode from the polluted memories of his own death. It's revealed by the shrine that Lin's friend in high places happened to be his new wife, who's a white lady now. How the fuck did he swing that? She weeps over her husband's broken mind, and laments that if only he could work again, his head would be set right. But the police have impounded his tools in Shantytown, leaving Chin-Lin to mime his work until their return. Seeing no other path to getting Daisy her revolution, we resolve to make our way to Shantytown to retrieve the gunsmith's tools.
Would having his tools back fix his mind?
Who cares? We're not getting any guns if Chen-Lin doesn't have his tools. Let's head to Shantytown.
Again, fair enough. I mean, what the fuck is he supposed to do in this situation? Go home? This is where Elizabeth questions whether or not toying with quantum physics so a bunch of people we've never met can exercise their Second Amendment right was the best of ideas. You know, I'm shocked an idea from the unhelpful twins turned out to have some horrific ramifications. Oh well. It's on the way to Shantytown that I feel reminded to emphasize how encounters really do break down when every time they end with this brick AI trying to pathfind its way to you on these open arenas. I'm really not expecting every NPC to behave like Elizabeth, but outside of a few audio cues, the enemy AI is very bare bones and predictable. They don't even give off the appearance of reactability, nor do they follow a strict but readable pattern. Every encounter just feels like the same strategies are at play. Hit with stick or point and shoot. So very forward thinkers, these authorities of Columbia. On our way to Shantytown, we...
You wanna ask me? Ask me.
About what?
My finger.
Sorry, I didn't...
It's all right. It's as much a mystery to me as anyone else.
Lady, why would you assume your missing pinky is at the forefront of my mind right now? There are other details about your character that seem to be of more pressing concern. Whatever, it's a nice exchange. Everybody noticed her cool, deformed hand. With some more sharpshooting, we reach the elevator down to Finkton Housing, Shantytown's less derogatory official name. As we descend, we get another exchange of character building.
You must think me some sort of freak.
Kinda.
I must seem ridiculous.
You just got dealt a bad hand.
Oh, you were talking to him. It's this conversation where we hear a hint of Elizabeth's rage toward Columbia seep through, and it's an emotion that will give her reason to believe in Daisy and her revolution, especially when we see the condition Fink and Father Comstock keep their workers living under. Shantytown goes a long way to humanize the Vox when we see not just what they're fighting to protect, but to provide a better tomorrow for. Signs are posted everywhere, making known the sheer need of this community. We see them want for medicine and food, some of which is blatantly kept from them behind iron bars thrown up by the state. Past gaunt and starving citizens tripping over themselves for food we bring through a tear, or children begging and singing hymns around the living quarters of these families, which all amount to not much more than a wet mattress curled up along whatever wall these people could find. In the graveyard shift bar, we catch the sparse working class of Shantytown able to spare coin for a drink, enjoying a part of town where life is cheap. In the basement, we see a kid terrified of grabbing an orange that will give him health. I know it will from experience. Elizabeth suggests that playing the guitar would lighten the mood down here. Turns out we string a pretty good lick and begin to play a hymn Elizabeth provides the vocals for while providing the boy a bit of fruit. It's a sweet moment, and I'm sure this song will have thematic relevance later, but for right now I can just appreciate the growing warmth between Booker and Elizabeth. This job has clearly ballooned to an absurd adventure, and all these two really have to latch onto are each other. It's very sweet to see Booker make genuine attempts to comfort her, in his own way. Down here there's a voxophone recording of Daisy too, and I gotta say, she sounds to be pretty authentic in her desire to stand up for the people down here, and she realizes she has the opportunity to provide a voice for those starving and destitute down in Shantytown. This, and some of the set design we see across Shantytown, is a pretty decent extrapolation of the tug-of-war between labor and capital that characterized the America of the early 20th century. It's a shame the anti-Semitic vending machine didn't make it into the game, though. Is that a Hebrew tailor? Oh, it could have been. I'm sure it would have been tasteful. This arena before the impound kind of blows, though. I do not get what they're going for with the skyline combat. These rails are used mainly to hop between different positions across the stage, but they seem to mainly focus on horizontal movement. This amounts to me chasing down clumps of enemies until, inevitably, I'm left to ride the rails in search of that final victim or two. Had they opted for more vertical design, using the skyline to soar between differing elevations and smaller, more controlled arenas, I think the combat here would be stronger. You'd think adding a roller coaster ride to your level would make it more interesting, but Infinite would beg to differ. We find our way to the basement of the Bull House, where the gunsmith's tools are located. Unfortunately, it turns out we're a couple of dipshits, because how we're supposed to lug these all the way back to Chen Lin is beyond me. Luckily for us, another tear appears over the tools, and should send us to a world where Daisy gets her guns and we get our airship. Fine, whatever. We pop into a reality where Chen Lin's tools remain at the shop, and as a result, Daisy's revolution is going better, but I fail to see what exactly we did in this scenario to accomplish any of that. Elizabeth is very excited for this revolution, wanting to be a part of a positive change for the underclass of Columbia. They're setting up some really interesting paths Elizabeth's arc could take. Maybe she becomes horrified by the violence necessary to this revolution, and is made to face realities of warfare that her romanticized book tellings could never capture. Maybe she has to reconcile her aversion to seeing others hurt with the brutal realities of fighting for a better tomorrow. Levine has given himself room to say some very profound things about systems of power and how they shape us as people. Let's see how he fucks it up. Pushing our way out of the impound, we find that the Booker of this world joined the Vox to get to Elizabeth, and after his death, he has become a martyr to these folk. We hear Daisy declare that the Vox are to storm Fink's factory, so we follow suit and head back upstairs.
When it comes down to it, the only difference between Comstock and Fitzroy is how you spell the name.
What? In what possible way are those two anything alike? Has anyone considered that Booker just might be racist? Also appear the dead Lins, and by this point Elizabeth is unable to shake the feeling of responsibility that tells her all the deaths of this world are her fault, given she basically wished this reality into existence. Fighting with the Vox gets us to Fink's doorstep until we're pinned down by suppressing fire from that there Zeppelin. Because we happen to be the only capable human being in Columbia, it's up to us to ride the rails and take it down from the inside. We do just that while the Vox cheer our name. This is a neat set piece.
That was amazing.
Come on, Elizabeth. Let's go find Daisy in the factory.
God, we're so cool. Finally, we make it to Fink's office just in time to watch Daisy shoot him a bunch of times. She's very enthusiastic. But she also knew the Booker of this world and declares us both imposters who must be killed. The Vox now turn on us, and after cutting them down, we catch Daisy about to murder Fink's son. Something she takes her sweet time thinking about. Understandable. This is a big decision. But when we get her attention, Daisy goes into this huge spiel about how the ideology behind the leaders of Columbia is so pervasive that, like weeds, you have to obliterate them at the root to avoid them taking over your garden. Before she's able to add an extra hole to that kid's head, however, Elizabeth has managed to sneak into that office and she shoves a pair of scissors right through Daisy's chest. And with that, Daisy Fitzroy bleeds out onto the floor and makes a swift exit from our narrative. I'd like to pause for a moment here, if I may. So far, I think the game has knocked it out of the park when it comes to the satirization of American values, but they dropped the ball hard with Fitzroy here. And is it any surprise they made Daisy this way, considering Levine did the same thing in the original BioShock? Think about it. Frank Fontaine founded orphanages and engaged in charity work to scam people into supporting a popular revolt that would put him in charge of Rapture. His plan just had to adapt, so he faked his death and became the folk hero Atlas, but he reveals by the end that it was all a ploy to disrupt Rapture in a revolution where he could grab power. But that's the original BioShock. I go into this because, taken at face value, this betrays a pretty nihilistic politics on Ken Levine's part, where those seemingly altruistic enough to garner a popular egalitarian movement are only doing so in a selfish bid for political control. But I know that's unintentional, both because these things have been hand-waved away as cautionary tales, and I understand that these characters are serving a narrative function. The problem is the guy did it twice, and the second time involved a much touchier subject matter than the ideas of some dead hag. People get uncomfortable about the Daisy thing, and Levine and crew have caught some flack for this. Rightfully so, I think, but I disagree that makes Levine and or Infinite racist in any way. I just think Levine didn't come to the logical conclusions of some of these story decisions for reasons I'll delve into later. But yes, it's finally time to talk about Daisy. I'm so excited. Levine has said he based the Vox off the Red Army faction, a West German militant group that arose first as a non-violent student movement in opposition to the reassertion of former Nazis into power of their new quote-unquote democratic government. I'll read from an Escapist interview here. Levine called the group passionate and compared it to grassroots student campaigns that became more militant as it became more organized, like the Red Army faction. This group starts out as a confederation of like-minded people, Levine said. As it becomes more serious and more organized, there becomes a need to enforce an ideology, an order, and a hierarchy. It also becomes more brutal. There becomes a line to toe. Different leaders emerge, and some leaders aren't as successful as other leaders, and you can imagine what happens to them. They get pushed aside, and a unified ideology comes into place. I'm really not trying to be mean to Mr. Levine, but think about this for more than 2 seconds. What's the difference between the Vox Populi and a group of young mid-20th century West German militants that formed in opposition to actual Nazis being handed back the reins of power to their state in a government we were propping up in order to quickly stave off the spread of communism? Turns out there's a lot, actually. Firstly, their membership looks nothing alike, and I mean that literally and figuratively. The context in which these groups exist are completely different, so much so that you have to squint to even begin to understand how we got here. It's because they both have violent confrontations with the state. And Levine is making the comparison because he's ignoring the fact that the state you're violently opposing is a part of this equation if you're considering the morality of a movement. Basically, what he's failed to recognize is that the fictional material circumstances the team created are so radically different from his inspiration that he's recontextualized them to a point that it perhaps betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of some historical realities and no one was willing to be yelled at anymore and they just wanted to finish the fucking thing. The RAF was a far-left group organized around communist ideas and were young and full of piss and vinegar, and so they thought they could speed up their revolution by killing political targets, and that put them into armed conflict with some cops because of course it did. The Vox Populi are made up of a racially enforced proletariat underclass that live in slums Infinite has a point to make us visit, while they're ground away in an early industrial hellscape for meager livings that go right back to their boss. We'll get to the race part in a sec, but I'd just like to emphasize that in a situation like this, the underclass might probably organize around the principle of the people who work in these factories ought to own them. You know, like in the thing that really happened in the setting they're basing their game off of. But we have to talk about the race part. I'm sorry, we do, because it is front and center all throughout BioShock Infinite, and yet Ken seems agnostic about taking this to its logical endpoint within the story itself. Look, I think it was unnecessary to make the Vox as violent as they were. I do think it was necessary to show a violent confrontation with the state, but I personally don't buy that the wanton destruction and indiscriminate killing Daisy wants to inflict would be in her character.
Think about the kind of person it would take to lead a popular movement like that. They'd have to be willing to sacrifice their life for their cause. And that cause, put simply, was a dream of a better world, not just for them, but for their fellow man. That just sounds righteous to me, and I would think that the person who would be at the helm of such a movement wouldn't be the kind of person to want to engage in such vicious violence just for the sake of general revenge. I just see the person willing to give their life for a better world they might not even get to enjoy as not being particularly vengeful. Being willing to die for a cause doesn't make you insane on principle. I'm sorry, the cause matters, and it matters if you consider it righteous or not. By the way, if your fictional resistance leader cuts a figure like that, then you've created a character that I'd say is very Christ-like. And wouldn't that have made for deeply compelling story material as these characters stand in opposition to a theocratic oligarchy by representing the very principles that have been twisted by structures of power, American power specifically? I think that would have made for a much stronger narrative, but it requires committing to a certain perspective that just doesn't make it through to these pieces. But no, by this point in the narrative, all that satire they were nailing towards the beginning gets treated like narrative window dressing. Stuff to add texture to the setting and make it a cool playground for Levine to flash interesting ideas he got from history or literature. Just like in Rapture, except for the fact that Rapture didn't showcase a very specific societal issue that America has yet to resolve, and so now you've just gone and made people feel icky. Maybe all this is happenstance. All just random plot threads haphazardly crystallized into a final product just to get it out the door, and I'm reading too far into things. But let's engage with this honestly for a moment and really think about the world the devs constructed and put yourself in the shoes of the people in those slums. Picture being a black person, maybe even a black convict, shipped to Colombia and made to do forced labor for Fink, and see how much better life up there is. How would you feel, being forced to listen to your boss constantly tell you how your time belongs to him, to never have any private space, to live in such frightfully unjust conditions while your work is stolen from you so an upper class can enjoy never having to dirty their hands with the work of running a utopia? Now picture that hierarchy is racially enforced. If you're down there, how would you not associate whiteness with the people doing this to you? And so how would you feel about white people, honestly? Maybe Colombia really would have exploded into an indiscriminate killing fiasco. I don't know, it's fictional. And hey, if that was really the route they wanted to go, then maybe there could have been something interesting to say about how American structures of domination can twist a group of people into violent seekers of bloodthirsty revenge, and how that's a tragedy that says more about the American system than, the people forced to live in it. But once again, Levine sacrificed interesting ideas and led us to a nihilistic political conclusion because I just don't think he has the perspective to truly grapple with what he's pulling from. Yeah, the reason Daisy was written this way, put simply, is middle-class anxieties. Being in the middle class, in America specifically, means you get to reap just enough of the benefits of this system without having to be made uncomfortable by the horrific realities of producing your pleasures. We live in a consumer society built on the backs of sweatshops and inconceivably unjust labor conditions for people we'll never face. Violence towards this state in any way makes middle-class people uncomfortable because they're worried about which side of the divide they'd fall on if the question was really asked, and so they would like the question to avoid being asked at all, and therefore all your martyrs have to be Christ-like only in the sense that they take it on the chin and never raise a hand against whoever is oppressing them, no matter how unjust that state oppression might be. It's like a weird logic filter that erases a level of nuance, where you equate being angry with an outwardly racist system of industrial domination with being a child-stabbing psychopath. In a world like this, violence was inevitable. What were the Vox supposed to do? Organize a general strike? At some point, Fink sends in the lobotomized steam train, and then these characters would have to make a choice in your story, and that choice might make some people uncomfortable. But guess what? You pick some thematic topics that make some people uncomfortable. You've got to commit. But no, you're supposed to be appalled all you want, but never angry. And the only way a story can justify this is by pulling the anger leads to hate and hate leads to the dark side card that you use in stories for babies. This is also a side effect of mass media in this country being made exclusively by and for the middle class, because one of the treats you get in this consumer society is video games funded by massive corporations. Ken Levine works in a professional industry available to you only if you are in an economic position to pursue it. There's just certain chains that are very hard to break depending on how far you are down the ladder. And not for nothing, all the black people that work for Ken would also be middle class, which does remove them from certain economically enforced outward realities for other black people. I'm of course not saying middle-class black Americans don't experience racism, or even if they experience less racism than poor black Americans. No one experiences race like black people in America, and I just don't think Ken has the people skills to really understand why someone might think violence against the state that makes people live like the underclass of BioShock Infinite is completely justified, but that they could feel that way and not want to unnecessarily hurt people. I'm basing this off my understanding that he was a terrible boss. Let me just say, for the record, I'm not judging anyone for having a perspective limited by economic circumstance. First of all, be as class conscious as you want. I'm a heavy doubter that the dream narrative I'm describing would have ever made it up the pipeline in any meaningful way. There's just too many corporate filter points, and they're built into the system.
But that's the thing. We're all products of this system, and it's designed to insulate Americans from certain perspectives because they are uncomfortable truths that are just hard to reconcile. Whatever device you're watching this on is probably using a computer chip made of precious metals taken at gunpoint from some poor Tanzanian miner. And that chip was processed and manufactured in an oppressive factory where labor conditions are so frightful only to keep up with the consumer demand of the American market. The reason the suicide nets are there ain't because the union asked for a trampoline. And we can be honest, much of that is the untold waste we produce in the corporate workings of the American day-to-day. A manufacturing plant in my local area threw away about 24K TVs, worth in total way more than my monthly wage, and way more than the wages being paid out to the people actually working there, for that matter. But they threw them all out because they didn't order them, and corporate couldn't help them place the actual recipient, so legally they had to just chuck them in a dumpster. And listen, this stuff makes me uncomfortable too. I'm just trying to paint as accurate a picture I can of the reality I can understand people are trying to avoid. And if I do these things, I have to be honest. I've just been told that frightens people. So not to let anyone involved in this off the hook, but I want to illustrate the situation like this. Ken is thinking of the characters in these stories like wind-up toys. He's setting them up in interesting settings and introducing the human element, so to speak, to these utopias and seeing how they collapse. The issue is Ken Levine doesn't have the perspective or experience to truly engage with some of the concepts he's pulling from, and so his stories lean on sci-fi concepts for the drama rather than meaningfully grappling with some of the things presented in the narrative. But certain things, like race and racism in America, are sensitive topics and should be handled with a level of reverence if you're going to approach them in your story. I think Ken just leaned too hard on his own experiences and what he understands political violence to look like. It doesn't help that after this, the focus on satire fades to the background to make room for character growth exclusively. And so this part of the story lands like it took a swan dive into shark-infested waters. And it turns out the sharks also have AIDS. But why would you listen to me about anything? I'm the crazy one, right? Everybody point and laugh at Captain Hideous. You know, I was originally going to name this channel the Video Game Fentanyl Jester. I realize I'm not helping my case. Anyway, we try to comfort Elizabeth after her little murder, but she hoofs it to the airship and hides out in the back room. Solemnly, we chart a course and find that Elizabeth has changed, both in clothing and as a person, and we have a little heart-to-heart. I find it very sweet that Booker is probably the only person capable of consoling Elizabeth at this point, given all we've done that still weighs on our own conscience. It's now that the two of them are faced with a decision, New York or Paris. Before we can make that choice, however, a familiar song calls that big chicken to come tear apart our airship, and we end up in free fall yet again as we make a violent reunion with Colombian soil. When we awake, we're greeted to the sound of the unhelpful twins trying to play the notes that summon the songbird. I see they've graduated from offering no help to becoming active impediments. Who the fuck are these people? And where did they get that piano? They finally manage to hit the right notes, which freaks Elizabeth out, but they assure us that, without the proper instrument, the songbird won't appear. Realizing Comstock uses music to command the bird, Booker asks if there's a melody he could play to subdue the big leather hawk, to which Madame Lutece suggests asking the prophet ourselves. Then they fuck off, and thankfully left this piano here for me to move. I'm so glad they're helping us. Meanwhile, storm clouds are forming over Columbia as the upper crust flee the city in droves to escape the wrath of the Vox Populi. It's unfortunate for us that the Vox are also making headway to Comstock's home, because now the route there is littered with blood-soaked immigrants trying to murder me, or as I like to call it, my Tuesday in Little Mexico. Outside, Elizabeth asks if Booker believes in Comstock's visions of the future, and he recounts the vision he had of some future New York being obliterated from above. One can only hope that this vision comes true and New York is actually wiped off the face of the earth. On the gondola ride up to the Emporia station, where we'll get access to the wealthiest neighborhood of Columbia, Elizabeth finally recognizes who half of the dynamic duo over here is. The woman is Rosalind Lutece, and it was her inventions that gave the city the ability to float, though she apparently disappeared some years ago.
Something tells me they're not exactly what they appear.
Really? Because they appear to be annoying, and so far that's been fairly accurate. This gondola station is an area that feels the most like something from the original BioShock. There's a few optional areas to explore and little mysteries to unravel past a few pickable locks. It's not as layered with optional rooms that do a hefty bit of world building as something like Poseidon Plaza, for example, but we're stretching our legs a little bit, and in this downtime we get some nice character stuff between Booker and Elizabeth the more we explore. It's a nice breather after some tough Vox encounters, and while I don't think this area will leave you as satisfied as any one level from the underwater place, it should still scratch that itch a little bit if having the freedom to explore these spaces is a huge draw for you. While searching for the code to this elevator that will take us out of the station, we're ambushed by Songbird once again, and are made to cower from his watchful eye. What does he spend his time doing off screen, by the way? Does he just fly in circles and scream? Once he leaves, we get another emotional moment with Elizabeth, where she makes us promise that we will keep her from being taken again, even if that means killing her, for she has decided that choosing her own death is preferable to life without freedom in the Prophet's cage. Emporia is a part of Colombia we've heard mention of here and there. It's the richest and most prosperous corner of town, which contrasts heavily against the evisceration the Vox have performed on this place. Decadent shops stand shoulder to shoulder with crumbling ruins and littered corpses as the war for the people tear its way to the heart of Comstock's floating disaster. Approaching Comstock House, the security system recognizes Elizabeth as Lady Seed, though it won't allow us access without the proper fingerprints. It's in this moment we see Elizabeth listen to her bubbling anger and resolve to take her mother's hand so we can make our way to the architect of her torture. This is a big moment for Elizabeth, and we see the lengths she's willing to go to in order to fulfill the hate that's been brewing ever since she learned of her parentage, and the decisions they made to keep her caged and alone for nigh on 20 years. She speaks to her mother's corpse with venom on her tongue, and demands that she be the one to take the hand, though we assert that we'll be the ones to do the deed. Before we can manage to, however, Comstock feeds his voice to us and activates some device to control Elizabeth's powers against her will, and he asserts that DeWitt has led her down a horrible path, one that Comstock hopes her mother will be able to steer her away from. With that, the casket erupts, and Elizabeth catches her breath and explains that her father used her to open a tear that created this apparition of Lady Comstock. The ghost still has two hands though, so we've got to chase after it. Lady Comstock has a penchant for raising the dead, which is an annoying habit of hers. Another annoying habit is her refusal to remain not alive, because she scurries off, leaving me with no idea what the fuck is happening anymore. Well, thank God the Lutesses are here to offer some poetic explanation that is sure to aggravate me. Basically, Lady Comstock, through the tear, is experiencing both life and death at the same time, and this is causing some issues she's struggling to reconcile. In order to return her spirit to rest, there are 3 secrets we must uncover to resolve her unfinished business in this world. And this is just fucking magic now, isn't it? Hey, you pencil-pushing geeks, what mathematical equation did you pull out of your ass to figure out how to lay a wayward soul to rest? God, I hate science. It's here that Emporia opens up, and you're given the freedom to follow this ectoplasm trail to the 3 secrets in whatever order you choose. There's a few optional places to explore for extra goodies, but even the station felt a little more dense in terms of what was packed in between arenas. There's also this mechanic in the game where if you uncover a code book hidden in the level, Elizabeth can decipher a Vox code to get access to something. I don't know. I'm not very incentivized to hoof it between major areas on the map when I've been doing just fine against these bricks and police uniforms. The first place I follow these freaky footsteps to is the Lutece Labs. The tear here reveals an argument between Lady Comstock and Madame Lutece regarding Elizabeth. She believes that Lutece is the lamb's real mother, because it certainly isn't her. It's then that Lady Unhelpful reveals something shocking. Exposure to the machine that opens tears and allows Comstock to peer into other realities to prophesize the future, well, it's made him sterile. On the way out, I catch another musical tear, this time playing Cyndi Lauper's Girls Just Want to Have Fun, which we heard coming from the carousel we visited like 10,000 words ago. I think the use of licensed music here is a fun way to showcase the effect of these tears on the people of Colombia and how central they are to every aspect of the city, including culture. Plus, these are some nice arrangements. The cover of Everybody Wants to Rule the World is a particular favorite of mine. But the in-house music does a good bit of heavy lifting here too, going hard on percussion to intensify being chased by Songbird, and relying on soft and somber strings to emphasize the more emotional moments in the downtime. There is a distinctive sadness to these pieces, which works phenomenally with the tone these scenes are aiming for. Next we head to the Bank of the Prophet, where all Colombians deposit their cash and hefty tithings to the Great Father Comstock. The tear downstairs reveals that the Prophet had Fink sabotage the Lutece's machine to murder them in such a way that it looks an accident. Elizabeth, considering all we've heard so far, theorizes that the apparition we're chasing isn't exactly Lady Comstock brought back to life, but rather some combination of her physical form and the rage Elizabeth harbors within herself towards her captors. Again, magic. Fuck your Arthur C. Clarke quote, I don't care. Speaking of the late Lady Comstock, she pries open this vault door and throws more undead enemies our way. Too bad I upgraded my murder of crows. Purchasing the ability to turn slain enemies into crow traps has officially kneecapped much of the challenge here, because the AI always barrels towards you and will inevitably get caught in one of these things. And from there, you get an exponential growth of cawing horrors. With the help of my raven friends, I defeat the ghost once more and head to our final tear. This one's in a photography studio, where the Lutesses, post-Fink-engineered accident, pay a visit to the man who shot their funeral portraits. I'm glad to know that they're in the business of upsetting all the world and not just me. You know, I noticed precious few of these have anything to do with Lady Comstock. It's mostly about these 2 hemorrhoids, and through some audio logs we get a fuller picture. Rosalind Lutece, harnessing the power of her machine, makes contact with a version of herself with balls. She eventually brings him over to her world, where the two continue their research and punching holes through the fabric of reality for the Prophet's benefit. In doing so, Comstock sees a vision of the future in which his daughter completes some holy mission known only to the man himself. However, it's exposure to the very machine cementing this prophecy that has made Comstock completely sterile. He got a baby from somewhere, though, and had his wife murdered for contesting the child's origins, and the Luteces killed for knowing them for sure. Unfortunately for him, these quirky assholes aren't dead, but scattered across the multiverse as a result of Fink's tampering with their technology. Now they get to pop in wherever they like, offering me almost useful ideas, and then disappearing before any real explanation is offered. So thanks for that, Zachary. This has provided Elizabeth with the character growth needed to confront this apparition and lay her to rest once more. We return to Comstock House, and the Lamb makes a plea to this woman she thought was responsible for imprisoning her. She tells the spirit that they must both forgive each other for not being that which they could never have been, mother and daughter. Both of them are victims of the Prophet's cruelty, though Elizabeth declares she will be victim no more. Her speech makes it through to Lady Annabelle Comstock, who questions how it is she can be alive if she was murdered by her husband. Elizabeth posits that she's experiencing a life where she never met the man, though the lady wonders if perhaps she's speaking through a world where she managed to save the soul of Father Comstock. The ghost then runs away with both hands, but she went ahead and melted through the security system, keeping Comstock House locked up tight. Now we can finally take the fight to the man himself. One of the problems I have with BioShock Infinite is that all of the shooting play kind of plateaus past a certain point, and most of the encounters end up feeling really similar, unless they do something to majorly shake up the arena. The writing has been the real draw here, and the thing that's carrying me between moments where I'm less invested in what I'm actually shooting at. Not only are we learning more details about Elizabeth and the nature of her internment, but we're also filling out Comstock's character, a man who, thus far, has had very little screen presence. We knew this guy was a bastard, but now the curtain has been pulled back and we see the lengths he was willing to go to in order to control Elizabeth. The relationship between Comstock and his adopted savior has changed with this new information, and it makes for a very dramatic approach to the man's fortress. Oh yeah, I forgot about him. Shit. Songbird hurls me into this building, and I can definitely take him. I'm just gonna need to sit here a second. Before the hawkish gimp has a chance to paint the room with my insides, Elizabeth intervenes. She pleads with him not to hurt us, and seeing no other way to save her only friend, Elizabeth promises to return to her tower. Satisfied, the songbird grabs her, and she reaches for us as the creature flies off to return the lamb to captivity. We won't let this happen. Booker regains himself and leaps to the bridge that will take us to Comstock House, where hell or high water, we are getting Elizabeth back. But something's gone wrong. A strange storm brews around us until we're swallowed up by it, and we find ourselves in a snow-covered parody of the Prophet's former home. As we approach, we hear poor Elizabeth being tortured through the terrors that litter this place. Whatever they're doing to her, they aren't planning on taking her back to the tower. What's even stranger is what we find inside, a statue to the seat of the Prophet herself, made in reverence to her furious judgment. We can even hear Elizabeth's speeches being broadcast throughout the building, though her voice is thin and weary, and the words she speaks don't belong to the girl we know. She sounds like Comstock. We can hear the sounds of our Elizabeth being subjected to some horrible experiment past this gargantuan locked door. We also wade through the lunatics of this asylum, all made vegetables apparently through Elizabeth's power over them. Then there's Elizabeth's new kids, the Boys of Silence, who erupt when they spot us and turn the lunatics into thuggish enemies that rush you until they're all put down. In order to get to the girl, we've got to access the warden's office on the 3rd floor of this madhouse. Welcome to the asylum. I really like this place. The vibes are creepy as hell, with distorted classical playing between Elizabeth's recordings as we wade past these men who have had their minds broken by the Lamb. Scattered voxophones fill out a little more information about the Boys of Silence, where Elizabeth asserts they are without blame, for their broken wills leave them without choice. A parallel to Elizabeth herself, as we hear how time washes over her in captivity, and her soul is beaten down by Comstock's oppressive torture. The terrors paint a horrifying picture of what these doctors did to the girl's body and spirit. But this room in particular breaks my heart, where Elizabeth asserts her love for her father the Prophet and regret over ever turning from his embrace. She denounces us who failed to save her, and refers to us only as the false shepherd, the man who taught her the meaning of hopelessness. Eventually, after wading past these fractured persons, we make it to the warden's office and open the way to the restricted area. We return downstairs and barrel our way to the operating theater to rescue Elizabeth. Only we can't. It was just a tear, and we're left alone again in the ruins of Comstock House. Okay, almost.
Lives, lived, will live.
Dies, died, will die.
Well, that was necessary. Inside the locked room, though, we see her. Distant at first, and only a foggy silhouette, slowly we approach, and Elizabeth laments the state of things. She's now powerless to do anything but watch as the horrible events she set in motion come to full fruition. Take her hand to see what she means. God, this was gut-wrenching to watch. At this point, it was pretty obvious that this was the reveal they were going for, but the preceding level did enough setup to make the reveal dramatic and utterly tragic. This is the fulfillment of Comstock's prophecy we keep hearing about. The whole reason Elizabeth was kept under lock and key her entire life. Through the tears, Father Comstock saw that the seed of the prophet shall sit the throne and drown in flame the mountains of man. And with his breaking of his daughter, our dream of apocalypse comes true, and it's all at Elizabeth's hand. She's now old and gray and as full of regrets as Booker. We were coming. We would have rescued her. If not for the certain death Songbird always manages to deliver to us, Elizabeth says. It's too late for her, and she used the last of her strength to pull us here so she could deliver a message to our Elizabeth, to keep her from befalling the same fate, where the years swirled down the drain and took with them any resistance left in the poor, battered lamb. With that, Elizabeth opens a final tear and sends us back to our reality. Which means there's still time to save her. And we do it not for the man in New York or under the burden of heavy debt. No, we can hear in Booker's voice how much he's grown to care for Elizabeth. How she now means so much more to us than just a means of wiping our ledger clean. No, this isn't about us. We've watched as she's gone from naive wonderment at the outside world to slowly accepting the grimness of reality and the guilt that comes from her terrible power. We've confided in her the roughness of our past, but she sees us as more than a collection of our sins. In fact, she's been our only friend too, and Comstock will not twist her into his perfect heir. There are 2 generators powering this machine they're installing into Elizabeth, and we hear her scream in agony while we make short work of the Colombian armed forces. Once the machine has been powered down, Elizabeth is able to open a tear once more, this time calling a tornado to tear this lab to shreds.
Elizabeth, I'll be right there!
Ew, what the fuck is in that syringe? What goo are they pumping into my friend? While we tie her corset, we hand Elizabeth a note from her alternate self. She's horrified to learn that our dream was indeed prophetic, and that she's the one to pull the trigger on the obliteration of the Sodom below. Booker tells her that this is a way to get past Songbird, and that all they have to do is find an airship and ride to Paris. But after everything, after all the torture, now knowing the nightmare it was in service to, Elizabeth refuses to leave. She will not allow her adopted captor to warp her into the woman we saw. She means to murder the prophet, to keep his future from ever coming to pass.
You forget. I know you.
I'm not going to let you kill him.
Really? Booker? What are you going to do to stop me?
Not a damn thing. Because I'm going to do it for you.
God, we're cool. We're approaching the climax of our narrative now, for the Hand of the Prophet, Comstock's flagship, floats just outside, ready to be boarded. On the elevator ride to the top floor, Elizabeth tells us she understands all of the note but the last bit, where she cannot interpret the meaning behind this drawing of a cage. Kinda inconvenient of the old gal not to elaborate on that part. Maybe she's been hanging around the twin migraines too much in her later years. The last of Comstock's forces descend upon us, and we cut them down to grab one of their police barges, the vehicle that will take us to Big Zach Zeppelin. The ride there gives us a view of Columbia in ruins, a state we've seen the city will never be able to shake. Our visit to the future paints such a depressing view of a lonely Elizabeth raining fire below from this cadaver of a utopia. This must be weighing heavy on the characters too, because our version of Elizabeth wonders if there's any redemption for the things they've done. And I think it's worth mentioning that, from Elizabeth's perspective, as the person capable of wading through the waters of infinity, I see no reason why she should at this point make any distinction between herself and her counterparts. She's speaking here not just of the responsibility she feels in creating a world that led to so much death and misery, but also the grim feeling of ownership over the bloodshed carried out by a counterpart that may as well have been her. Elizabeth and Booker are united in regret now, and Booker tells her he can't see much use in redemption.
Booker, are you afraid of God?
No. But I'm afraid of you.
Oh, so that's what that was. And with that, after a few more barges try to get between us and the Prophet, we arrive at the flagship. This is a series of arenas where we're bombarded with the Vox and the remaining holdouts of the Colombian police. This is probably the best stretch of gameplay in the entire piece. Having both the Vox and the cops makes for a level of enemy variety that I feel like has me more engaged in terms of strategizing around the different ways I can get shot. I'm mixing up plenty of vigors and swapping weapons as I run out of ammo to make the most of what can be found on the battlefield. And with so many tougher enemies, when Elizabeth tosses me salts and health, I really feel the impact in the heat of all this fighting. And the arenas are just the right size, big enough that skyline riding between pockets of interest is actually a useful means of quick traversal, but not so spacious that 2 or 3 enemies are stuck aimlessly pathfinding their way to me. The level and opponent design is just meshing together beautifully here, and I feel like I'm experiencing the gameplay loop that Infinite was intending the whole time. You can make the argument that playing on hard would have given me that all along, and to that I say, I am a thumbless simpleton. You're lucky I was able to get this far. The final skyline will take us to the Prophet's cabin, and we hear the man taunt us as we approach. He tells us that we've come to wipe our slate clean, but that some sins are so egregious they can never be forgiven. And something tells me we're not talking about debt anymore. Inside the cabin, the first thing we see is a model of Monument Island that depicts the giant machine we caught on the way in. It's called a siphon, and it's the technology Comstock was using to drain Elizabeth of her powers, with the Lamb herself surmising it's this machine that keeps her from creating tears, rather than just opening them as she does in adulthood. We also catch a tapestry in here that showcases set pieces from our journey, including one that has yet to pass. The Prophet was waiting for us, and he beckons to Elizabeth. He's calm and sweet, offering fatherly affection while he washes her of the marks of our journey. Everything he did to Elizabeth, he says, was for her own protection. For the prophecy Comstock is betting the entire farm on was twofold. Elizabeth is destined to destroy all but Columbia in a baptism of fire, but only as long as she is not led astray by Booker DeWitt, the false shepherd. Then he turns to us. Father Comstock laughs at his own stupidity for unleashing the might of Columbia against us when all he had to do was demand the truth. Seeing him grab Elizabeth sends us into a rage. We grab the old bastard and beat him, calling him a monster for all he's done to his own child and utterly repulsed at his attempts to blame us for Elizabeth's disfigurement. And with that, we drown the man of God in his own baptismal font. Once we calm down, though, Elizabeth wants to know what he meant about her pinky. Booker has no idea. But he does have a nosebleed. The final answer to this mystery must be behind one of Elizabeth's doors. With no other choice, we resolved to destroy the siphon and prove to her that we had nothing to do with her imprisonment. How we plan on falling the whole tower is a detail we'll have to work out on the way. On the way out, we get a hint as to why the Prophet was so adamant to have Elizabeth finish his work. The man was dying. Exposure to the Lutece's machine has rapidly aged him and riddled him with tumors, like the universe itself is diluting him the more he peers into the infinite. As we chart a course to Monument Island, Elizabeth muses over the final part of her letter, trying to unwrap the significance of that repeated drawing of a cage. She doesn't have much time to think about it, however, because we're beset by the forces of the Vox Populi, determined to tear apart this floating monument to all they despise. Luckily for us, Elizabeth has an epiphany and begins to whack the statue that calls the songbird to reach the instrument inside. Why? Because the illustrations don't refer to the word, they refer to the letters. C-A-G-E. The notes necessary to control Songbird. Hitting the statue summoned the man in question, but Elizabeth was right, and by playing the notes, that giant kinky eagle is made docile. She embraces him, and quietly asks him to protect her one last time. This is the final stretch of gameplay. The Vox are boarding our ship, and they're throwing everything they have at us, including motorized Patriots that drop from those fuck-me-sized Zeppelins. At the center of the command deck is the ship's power, and these soldiers will swarm it in an attempt to down the ship. But with Songbird on our side, it's only a matter of time before he and I manage to tear apart the remnants of Daisy's dream. This is a fun climax. It's fairly brain dead since this is a mostly flat space with cover peppered across the map, but I enjoy the gauntlet you're made to fight through. And having access to Songbird is neat in theory, but it really doesn't amount to much since in order to progress you need to destroy the Vox Zeppelins, making them easy priority targets. Once you use them, there's a lengthy cooldown period, meaning your best strategy is to just keep doing what you've been doing and shoot away at the enemies once they board you and save Songbird for the Zeppelins, which only he can destroy anyway. You don't need to worry about the health of this battery that much, I promise. Eventually, the last of the Vox meet the business end of my shotgun. We meet Elizabeth at the bow of the ship overlooking the ruins of her tower. She aims to use Songbird to demolish that which still stands, destroying the siphon and giving Elizabeth access to all of reality to discover the truth behind her missing finger. She offers us the whistle, and, well, I'll let Booker speak for himself.
Tear it down. Tear it all down.
How is that thing? No, that's what we meant when we played the... Whatever, it doesn't matter. Songbird obliterates the siphon, and in a magnificent explosion, the machine pours Elizabeth's power back into her, making her glow as her full strength returns. Unfortunately, this also fries the Whistler, meaning that BDSM buzzard is back to wanting to turn me into a finely ground paste. This understandably starts to freak us out, but Elizabeth calmly asserts that he won't make it to us before creating a tear like she did in her youth. Our new setting fades in gradually as we see Elizabeth has transported us underwater, where Songbird literally cracks under pressure. As he dies, Elizabeth tries to comfort him, her way of saying goodbye to this creature she knew as warden, protector, and friend. But who gives a fuck about that? The rest of the setting slowly fades into view as Lemaire begins to play, and we realize that Elizabeth has indeed brought us to Rapture, to a recreation of that game's opening rooms, as a matter of fact. It's a short visit, but incredibly cool that they incorporate the original story into that of Infinite in such a seamless way. They lost points on this front later on, but I don't want to talk about that right now. Elizabeth hurries to the bathysphere, clearly able to see far beyond what our singular perspective can accommodate. Booker is now confused, and Elizabeth tells us she can't explain. She can only show us. And so we take the bathysphere on a tour out of Rapture, back up to the lighthouse that stands solitary in the Atlantic. Elizabeth marvels at the stars, and when we pass through Ryan's door, we see them as she does. These are not stars, but lighthouses, each a different doorway to another city, another time, another place. Reality is laid bare before us, and Elizabeth explains that each world is similar to the next, yet different in subtle ways, as the universe hinges on its constants and its variables in detail. The game is now going heavy on themes of determinism, the philosophical idea that all events in the universe were preordained by preceding events and natural law, and are therefore inevitable. This comes to a head when, after passing through another door, we see an ocean of our duplicates from an untold amount of other Columbias end up in the same bottomless soup that we're swimming in. And I can get down with that. I think free will is a delusion we made up to make ourselves feel like actual people instead of the empty-headed pretend creatures getting pushed through the bowels of existence that we truly are. This point speaks to me, is what I'm saying. This next door takes us to a place Booker remembers. 20 years ago, wrought with unspeakable guilt over the innocents he massacred at Wounded Knee, he arrived here, desperately hoping for some kind of redemption. It was offered in the form of baptism, and it's a baptism Booker almost accepts, his desperation for forgiveness coloring the sadness in his voice. But at the last minute, he breaks free from the preacher's embrace, pushing against the waters of God's grace and past his fellow sinners, hoping to be made clean again. Why? Even Booker thinks he's beyond salvation. We've had enough of this, and suggests taking a door to Paris and leaving Columbia behind. But Elizabeth asserts that Comstock was there at the baptism, and she won't leave until he's been erased. Next, we walk into our office, where we depict the agreement between us and Male Unhelpful over there. We're to bring him the girl, and our debts will be paid. Except there's a detail we don't remember, because now there's a baby chilling in the corner over here, and Booker is destined not to leave the room until he hands over the infant. As it turns out, this is the girl who Tess wanted. We're back on the boat now, disoriented and confused. How could we not have known about the baby? What don't we remember? Elizabeth must know, for now she can see through all the doors that connect the tapestry of existence, and she will not rest until she has wiped Comstock from the display. Dead in one world, alive in another. Until the prophet can be halted from ever living in the first place, he will always be a specter haunting the now omnipresent Elizabeth. So what's on the other side of this door? Heartbreak. In fact, I'll just let this play.
Hey, the deal's off, you hear me?
Unstable.
The deal is off!
It's
Give her back!
fine, hurry!
Give her back!
Fine, are you mad?
Give her back, you son of a bitch!
It's ready! Go!
No! No,
Shut
no, no!
down the machine!
No!
Shut it
Anna!
down! Shut down the
Anna!
machine! Now do it!
Give me back my daughter! No! Anna!
So that's reveal number one. Elizabeth Comstock is actually Anna DeWitt, who Booker sold to pay off his debts, but soon found he couldn't go through with the deal, and he desperately tried to get his daughter back. Comstock managed to pull her through to Columbia, in the process severing her pinky and giving Elizabeth the power to travel between worlds, but leaving Booker alone and weeping, as he realizes his daughter is lost to him forever. For 20 years, we rotted in this room with only an ocean of regret to keep us company. And, as penance, we branded ourselves with Anna's initials as a constant reminder of the sin we will never be able to shake. Until Robert Lutece, post-atomization, realizes the damage he's done and the damage that will be done at Elizabeth's hand, and returns to offer us a chance to reunite with our daughter. Of course we accept. Only passing through a new reality for the first time is so traumatic it scrambles our brain, and in recovering our minds stitch together new memories from our old ones. And these assholes didn't find it necessary at all to clue me in on that. I think I hate these people. With the truth revealed, a somber Booker promises to undo all this, to go back to before Columbia and keep Comstock from ever setting his sights on Elizabeth. But the causality of the universe is tricky. Ripples branch out and bounce off one another in such a tangled fashion that one can never be sure how far back to go. But Booker does. He would do anything to undo the pain we caused our daughter, and so we resolve to walk through that door to the moment of Comstock's birth, so we can strangle him and undo all the tragedy his life will sow. The door doesn't take us where we expect. We're back at the baptism. Except this isn't the same place. Alternate versions of Elizabeth appear and they all begin to explain the terrible truth to us. In our world, we rejected the baptism. In others, we accepted, and became born again as a new man with a new name. Zachary Hale Comstock. The only way to stop the entire Columbian nightmare from ever transpiring, the only way to save Elizabeth from the torture that befalls her in the clouds, is to die before the choice is ever made, keeping Comstock from becoming a reality. And with that, we let the Elizabeths drown us in a final baptism that washes the slate clean. Singular piano notes accent the ending. With each one, another Elizabeth disappears, and right as we're about to see what happens to ours, we cut to black. Well, the crazy bus has finally arrived at Insanity Station, where the more you try to think about things, the closer you get to a straitjacket and a rubber room. I'm used to that though, so let's break this ending down. Detractors of Infinite's story have, perhaps rightly, called this finale nonsensical. We've established that there is a never-ending series of worlds that are similar yet different, some in minor ways, others in major ones. If that's the case, then how does drowning this one booker erase Comstock from existence when there are a billion other bookers who would have still made that same choice? Here's where the rub comes in. Levine wanted to tell a very personal story, but the plot device he used as a vehicle for that story is the most impersonal he could have chosen. I don't mind it when stories explore the concept of infinite realities, or our place in the infinite of our own reality. Hell, those turned out to be some of my favorite stories in literature. The issue is that's very existential theming, and like the Daisy stuff, if it's not handled appropriately, it can throw a huge monkey wrench into the rest of the gears. Evoking the vastness of the cosmos makes us feel small and without agency, which is usually why that ends up being the template for things like cosmic horror. Frankly, we should feel helpless when faced with the reality of our place in the universe. And if the multiverse really did exist and proved with certainty that we live in a deterministic reality where all of our choices have been preordained by dominoes that have been falling into each other since the beginning of time, well, that might inspire a pretty pessimistic conclusion in regards to humanity. It would definitively prove that our choices are not our own, and that we are indeed puppets walking and talking like we really exist while having no idea the strings are even there. And again, I'm fine with pessimism. On account of I'm a pessimist. But doesn't that feeling inspire a disconnect not just from yourself, but from other people? The same happens to our characters. And without those narrative guardrails establishing concrete rules for this sci-fi concept, you've created a setting where characters are just as much puppets incapable of making real choices as humans would be. And then they go and hinge the entire narrative on the choice of one guy, without exploration of why that guy would even make one choice over the other in the first place. Ken, buddy, you cannot tell a story about determinism while keeping your conception of the self as an immutable entity capable of choosing what it chooses. They're incompatible. If this is a story about Booker finding redemption for his past actions, doesn't it take the wind out of the sails when we find out those actions were preordained? Doesn't it kind of let him off the hook when we find out, based on the mechanics of the universe, there were no other choices he could have made than the ones he chose? Characters have no agency in a decidedly deterministic world, and so if you still want me to feel like they're actual people taking responsibility for their decisions, then you can't tell a story about determinism. Sorry. With all that said, this ending fucks me up. I remember beating Infinite for the first time and being just unable to sleep that night. I felt so moved. Why? It doesn't make any fucking sense. Well, it's because I think you just have to accept the conditions the piece is laying out to you. How does drowning Booker erase Comstock from existence if by nature of existence there will be a never-ending series of Bookers and Comstocks making those same choices? I don't know, and there are probably a million different ways you could justify or contradict the ending based on how the story was presented. But I don't care. And I don't care for the same reason I didn't want to overthink the obvious holes that got poked in this personal story when we decided to step through our first tear. The emotion behind this scene is so powerful to me that it supersedes any questioning of the logic behind the thing. I'm a firm believer that stories don't have to make sense. As far as I'm concerned, if the storytellers have made me feel something, then they've done their job. Who gives a shit about plot holes or inconsistencies if you're genuinely moved by the end? The caveat to this, of course, is you have to stick the emotional landing. I would be harder on BioShock Infinite if I felt it didn't, but in truth, I really feel that it does. And the main reason for that is the performances from our two leads. I've deliberately kept from commenting on Troy Baker and Courtney Draper's vocals for the most part because their deliveries are the heart of Infinite, and I couldn't note them piecemeal. To really understand why this was such a poignant narrative to me, I'm going to have to sing their praises in full. Draper's Elizabeth begins bright and exuberant in delivery, so happy to be free of her tower and experiencing the minutiae of everyday life in Columbia. But she hardens the more we're with her, and we see her anger towards the city rise from an undercurrent to the driving force behind her words. We see her use her magnificent power to get us where we need to go, until she realizes the terrible consequences of doing so. Then she's forced to make a decision that horrifies her, and we hear how she becomes resigned to the choice she made, uniting her and Booker in regret. When confronting her adopted mother, Draper gives Elizabeth a dry coldness as she prepares to defile her body, until the truth is revealed and we can hear in Draper's voice how desperate Elizabeth is to connect with Lady Comstock, to offer her peace. She leaves that encounter with a new understanding of the extent of her father's cruelty, and then gets to experience it firsthand as her screams provide the soundtrack for Booker's asylum exploration. And it's there that we hear old Elizabeth, whose written words would be nothing if not for the beaten down performance by Draper, emphasizing just how much time has rotted away at her. When we return to our Elizabeth, she's now become something angry and vengeful. Not as she was before, swinging wildly at Columbia's injustices. No, now we hear that anger becomes singularly focused on Comstock. Draper has hardened Elizabeth after all she's been through, and there's now a confidence in her that demands the prophet's head. By the end, once the siphon has been destroyed, Elizabeth becomes something else, some calm and collected deity able to read the universe's palm and understand all there is, past, present, future, and otherwise. That is an insane character arc, and guess what? Courtney Draper sells it the whole way through. Then there's Booker. His moments are a little more subtle, which fits the character. The distance he puts between him and Elizabeth fades through circumstance keeping them together, and we hear in his voice how he slowly gets more emotional towards his companion. You can actually hear Booker gradually get more concerned and protective of Elizabeth, and Baker's warmer delivery sells the growing relationship between these two as much as anything be done on Draper's end to endear us to Elizabeth. But the thing that really hits in Baker's performance is the smaller moments. The moments where Booker is forced to confront his own regrets. Listen to this exchange during the baptism.
Are you ready to be born again?
I am.
Do you hate your sins?
I do.
Do you hate your wickedness?
Yes.
Do you want to clean the...
God, I could cry just listening to the guy simmer with so much sorrow over what he's done. Shit, man, I've done things I have a hard time forgiving myself for. I've done things that make me seek deliverance wherever I can find it. I so desperately relate to a man attending a baptism as some final hope of washing away the sins that haunt him. I'm sure we all can, but I relate especially to the brokenness in his voice, to the sadness in his delivery when he thinks back to the personal failings that led him to hurt so many people. God, this story just puts the screws to my heartstrings. A man swallowed up by his own regret over an unforgivable sin is given the chance at redemption, the chance to rescue his own daughter from the people that took her from us decades ago. Without question we accept, but in some bitter twist of fate our memories are taken from us, and we're made to do the job on false pretenses. But the regret never left. The regret that poisons our soul, the regret that led to the drinking and the gambling and the loss of Anna. But through our journey with Elizabeth, we're given the opportunity to get this one thing right. And eventually, we come to care for her and say nuts to the man in New York. We save her because she means that much to us, even when we had no idea who she really is. Booker's daughter saved his soul as a stranger to him, and he in turn is willing to die to undo the pain we caused her through an echo of our own branded hand. A hand later bandaged by Elizabeth, symbolizing that only by rescuing her soul can ours too be healed. The only person capable of redeeming Booker was Anna, and in turn the only person capable of saving her from her own burdens is us. The preacher might not be able to absolve us of our sins, but Elizabeth can, and she washes us clean. This is the story I think Infinite tells so well. The dialogue is the left hook and the performance is the right. There's plenty of great things going on elsewhere, but there's many flies in the suit because most of the interesting stuff gets carted away to make room for this part of the narrative. That wasn't the right call. However, what's here is delivered so beautifully that I find myself just being moved by the story, regardless of how much sense it makes. I understand being put off by all these nonsensical plot devices, and I'm telling you to just let it go. If you can do that and latch onto these characters and their journey, you might just see the heartbreaking narrative that I do. If there's an objective standard for these kinds of things, then I think BioShock Infinite would probably be a strong 7 out of 10. It's a miracle it came out as solid as it did, given the 9 circles of development hell this thing went through. The gameplay is serviceable and not particularly interesting, and at a certain point the story goes so far off the rails that it turned many people off to it. With that said, a lot of what works speaks to me. The American satire may have been fumbled with Levine's depiction of Daisy in the Vox Populi, but the opening few hours are simply masterful criticisms of the American empire and the culture it produces. It puts up a real funhouse mirror to the present we're living in, and the game plays with real-world history to make those criticisms more poignant. The sci-fi stuff is pretty dumb, but they're in service to our characters, and I like these voices almost as much as the ones in my head, so I'm okay with that. I completely understand if you're not sold on it though, because Levine really did write himself into a corner by not appropriately playing with that plot device. You'll notice in my description of what moves me, I don't mention this multiverse shit once. This is a game you should probably approach with caution. If you love the original, there's very little shared DNA between these pieces that I can find. But taken for what it is, well, obviously find it a very emotional journey. I really do think the performances are enough to captivate you, but if you're the kind of person who gets taken out of a story because of some major narrative inconsistencies, then stay the hell away from BioShock Infinite. It might kill you. If you can look past all that doesn't work and just focus your attention on the gooey, emotional center of this freakish creation, then you'll have lots to chew on. Hell, the opening hours alone depict such a masterful parody of the United States and says so much about this country that I could recommend the game on that alone if you find it interesting. Time really has soured on Infinite, but it will always hold a special place in my heart. I prefer it to the original, frankly. I'm just more interested in what this game is trying to say, and I connect more with it because it has such a strong setting and such captivating central characters. I'll never forget what it was like to beat it for the first time. So there you go, Ken. I love your story, and I'm willing to go to bat for it, even when it falters where it matters and ultimately makes no sense. It still really hit me, so thanks for that. I feel like a big liberal arts-shaped tumor has been excised from my frontal lobe. Oh, there's so much real estate in my brain for important things now, like knowing by heart every democratically elected government the United States has ever toppled. I may not know my mother's birthday, but I know that. Guatemala, Iran, the Congo, Chile, the Dominican Republic.
There's a room where the light won't find you. 14 hands worth of walls come tumbling down.